Hi folks, time to wrap up January's reading. I go through each of the science fiction books that I read during January. I talk a little bit about what I thought about them, and then I rank them mercilessly, and ultimately I'll declare a book of the month. Before we get into that, there's two or three also-rans that didn't quite make the finishing line for January. The first is Hard to Be a God by the Strugatsky brothers, and I DNF'd this at about the halfway mark. I just found it really dull and a bit stilted. That might have been partly at least due to the translation, which came to English via German from the original Russian. The Strugatskys are important writers in their context. Who am I to argue with that? But that's against the background of Soviet-era realpolitik. But in my experience so far, at least, it just doesn't work for me. And it wasn't aimed at me, and that's fine. And I shan't be rushing out to read any more of the Strugatskys that are lurking on my shelves. So that was a fail for January. Or let me reframe that as a success in that I didn't plough on and waste time reading the second half. So we'll call that a win. And then there's one more book that I had on my planned TBR pile for January that I didn't quite finish. I'm nowhere near finishing, in fact. As I sit here on the 1st of February, I've still got about 3/4 of it left to go. And I must admit that I am finding that it's not flowing very well for me. My initial impression, based on the first quarter of it, is that there's a bit too much world building and not enough story. So far, anyway. It may redeem itself in the final 3/4 or so that I've got left to read. I also picked up on audiobook Simon R. Green's Deathstalker, which I'm a good 80% through. I should probably finish it tomorrow, in fact. In summary, I'm having tremendous fun with it. I think it's an 80% tribute or homage to earlier space operas and about 20% parody or piss take of them. It's got a very dry sense of humour, which I certainly appreciate. So more on those two next month. Right then, in the order that I read them, let's get into the books that I did actually finish in January. First up is Ashes of Man by Christopher Ruocchio, which is the 6th book. No, it's not. It's the 5th book in the Sun Eater series. Getting ahead of myself there a bit. I didn't enjoy Kingdoms of Death, which was book 4, as much as I enjoyed the first 3. So my expectations have been lowered a little bit as I headed into this one, Ashes of Man. The opening couple of 100 pages of this one are all set up. This sort of mopping up exercise after the carnage of the previous book. The final 300 pages of this one were all crash bang action, and my goodness, Ruocchio is not messing about with his protagonist, who continues to go through some things, let's just say. Hadrian Marlowe is now several hundred years old, and over 1,000 years have passed since he was born. The difference between those two things spent in stasis or hypersleep or reefer sleep or whatever the hell it's called in this book. In all that time, he has served the Empire in the fight against the Cielcin, the aliens of the peace. Hadrian's early dreams of making peace with the Cielcin have been dashed, rendered repeatedly hopeless. The carnage at the end of book 4 has to be explained to Legion intelligence and ultimately to the Inquisitors of the Chantry. The bad news for the Empire is that the Cielcin are now more united than ever and continue to rampage, killing and enslaving and eating their way through the worlds of the Solent Empire. And there are new threats, new alliances and new dangers for the Empire too. This entire series is big, bold and epic, and very happy being so. Is it a little bit derivative? Yes, I think it does borrow heavily, but I would argue not obtrusively so from the many space operas that have come before it. If you like your space opera widescreen and epic, or if you like your science fiction leavened with some fantasy elements, then I heartily recommend Sun Eater in all of its technicolor glory. I give Ashes of Man 9 out of 10. It's a galactic gem. In quite a change of scene, next is Other Days, Other Eyes from Bob Shaw. And Alban Garrod has invented something called slow glass. And light does not pass through slow glass in the usual way. It's delayed. Or there's some physical effect which gives it the appearance that it's been delayed. Anyway, let's put it that way. The delay property was actually discovered accidentally after it caused inadvertently some accidents when installed as super tough windscreens in cars and planes. You can imagine that might cause a difficulty if the light is delayed by even a second or two when it comes to turning out onto a busy road or trying to land a plane, for example. And so that's how slow glass was discovered by accident. Through one plot thread and several tangents, Bob Shaw explores different uses for this slow glass. Light of Other Days is one such tangent, which was previously published as a short story, and I think probably an award-winning short story at that. A couple is on a driving holiday around the Highlands of Scotland, and they come across a farm which has a field full of slow glass panels, drinking in the beautiful views. The farmer is selling the plates of glass, and the price varies by thickness, or rather the amount of built-in delay. Are you buying 5 years of beautiful views or 10, for example? And the glass has to stand in the field for that length of time to charge. That's really the basis for all of the other stories or tangents in the book too. It's really a fabulous idea, and there are plenty of twists along the way. To what uses could such a slow glass be put, for good or for ill? There are cosmetic uses, such as the picture windows, or scene doors as they're called, like from the Highlands of Scotland. There are street lights which simply pour out the light charged up during the day from the daylight, so it's just daylight coming through at night. Slow glass can be used to solve crimes if there's a handy slow glass nearby to record the actions. Slow glass can even be used as a sort of weapon if charged light can be released in an instant. In a more sinister turn, perhaps, slow glass can also be used by the government to spy on the people. Any piece of slow glass, however small, can record what it sees for later retrieval. And with that espionage in mind, those clever streetlights now have a more sinister feel to them. And of course, then countermeasures are developed to ensure continued privacy. It's only a slim book, but it's jam-packed with thought-provoking ideas, all built around that notion of slow glass. I really liked the inventor and amateur detective Al Garrad, and I thought that the relationship with his wife was done really well. I give Other Days, Other Eyes 8 out of 10. It's a stellar splendour. Next, we'll cover the Waystations trilogy by Nick Scrimgeour. She's a Scottish author, and she's written several books, I think all self-published, with some new ones on the way too. I listened to these on audiobook. I listened to all three of these books during January, and together they tell one story. And I feel like the quality was pretty consistent across all three of the books. So for ranking purposes, we'll consider them as one unit. Those Left Behind is the first book, and teeming billions live on isolated New Palace, the vast majority in dirty, polluted slums on and under the surface, with the more fortunate living topside in high-rise buildings, and the even more fortunate, cybernetically advanced people living on Exodus Station in orbit. It quickly transpires that Exodus is a way station built long ago by who knows who, a portal to somewhere. We're quickly introduced to a small group of folks who go on to be the main point of view characters in this and the following books. There's Alvira, the driven captain of the Exodus station, and then there's Ridley, a slum dweller, a surfacer with a talent for languages, and Kojin, who's the Exodus flyboy, the pilot of the Ranger, the ship that they plan to use to test the Exodus gate, which they hope will be a means of escape for the billions on New Palace whose planet is slowly dying. There are other characters that we meet along the way, but those are the three main human characters. And I make that distinction because there are several different alien species involved at the other end of the portal, a galaxy full of them, it seems. Will the Coalition, the governing body for this mixed bag, allow in tens of billions of humans from New Palace? Who put the Waystations there, and what is their real purpose? And why have so many different species found their way to the same patch of galaxy using these Waystations? The Idran Var are set up as the baddies of the piece, an enemy for the Coalition legionnaires to fight, and they're shaping up for a big, decisive final war. But is there something even more dangerous, something bigger and more deadly even than the Idran Var, poised to come through the Waystations? Those once forgotten, the second book picks up right where book one left off. And the characters we meet in Those Left Behind have been scattered across the galaxy by this time, picking up a cast of secondary characters along the way, and each of those plot threads fulfilling a different necessity for the story. By this stage, there's actually a large cast of characters, and I enjoyed the world Scrimgeour has built. We get a little bit more insight in this book into what built the Waystations and the threat that they present. We also get more hints that this is merely the latest in a cycle of such threats over millennia, and we even get to meet living evidence of this. There are space pirates, black marketeers, mercenaries, double-crossing thieves, self-centered politicians, flawed and cynical soldiers to be redeemed, and there are several different alien species, and maybe the Idran Var aren't so very different after all. The big question is, can the warring enemies unite to face a common existential threat? I think that Nick Scrimgeour develops the characters well, and I enjoy the different alien species. The interactions and the relationships between them are pretty good, I thought. Those Who Resist is the conclusion of an enjoyable trilogy, and I think that Scrimgeour sticks the landing. It's a good conclusion to the story arc. The well-signposted bigger threat, bigger even than the Idran Var, manifests itself, and the reason or logic behind their mindless attacks becomes clear, as does a possible way to stop it. I enjoyed the sweep of the story. I felt vested in the various characters, some of whom go on quite a journey over the course of the three books. A couple of the will they, won't they relationships resolve, mostly in a pretty satisfying way. There's some noble sacrificing going on, and there's some last gasp rescuing it in heroics, of course. Overall, I found the Waystations trilogy to be a fun space opera. I think if you enjoyed Becky Chambers' Wayfarers books, then there's something in here for you with the characters, the humans and the aliens and the relationships between them. Equally, if you tend more towards the kinetic space opera, say Neil Asher or Peter Hamilton, then Waystations is maybe a little bit lighter in tone, but I suspect that you'd enjoy spending time with these books anyway. I give the Waystations trilogy 7 out of 10. They're a collective planetary pleasure. Onto meatier, richer fare now. The Promise of the Child was next. This is the first book in the Amarantine trilogy by Tom Toner. And this is densely written space opera in a good way for the most part, I think. There's no exposition, there's no pages of explaining references or the history of anything. There is zero hand-holding. I wouldn't say it was a struggle to read, but it definitely demands a careful read. It took me well over a week to make my way through. It's quite unusual for me for a book. And I was building a picture as I went, gradually accumulating half an idea maybe what the hell was going on by the end of it. We're about 12,500 years in the future, and essentially the world and the surrounding galaxy is unrecognisable. And slightly weirdly, for a space opera, the book opens in 14th century Prague. We're introduced to a character, Aaron, who reappears later. Yes, 13,000 years later. The Amarantine are the longest-lived branch of humanity, immortal to all intents and purposes. And strange things seem to happen to the human body over that period of time, including developing a number of capabilities. Humanity has either evolved or has been re-engineered or refracted into subspecies, into what's known as the prism collectively. There are a bewildering number of these subspecies. Some are loping giants like the Melius, who live mainly on Earth, it seems, and some are knee-high, bitey creatures, and there are all points in between. Tom Toner throws a bewildering barrage of names and labels at you, and it can be a job to interpret what on earth he's talking about in any given sentence. Fortunately, the publisher was sensible enough to include a pretty good glossary of terms to which I was a frequent referrer. What is this word? Is it an individual, a species, a place? I don't know. So what's it about? Well, the Prism, or some of them at least, have had enough of being bossed about by the Amarantine. And the Amarantine are ruled by the oldest Amarantine, with the downside that extreme old age usually results in a certain amount of insanity. And the Amarantine are busy squabbling over who should take over next. Much of the action is based on a much changed Earth, but there are also enormous space habitats, seemingly hollowed out moons, and then the Amarantine prefectures in several solar systems. It's a broad canvas, and Tom Toner does not paint in broad brushstrokes, the normal stock in trade for space opera. This is finely detailed work, almost pointillist in its precision. I have to say that The Promise of the Child, and presumably the other books as well, are not for the faint-hearted. The prose is excellent, I thought. I think Tom Toner is clearly a good writer, and as far as I'm able to judge, better and more literary than your typical space opera for sure. But it is pretty opaque. The pace is often slow and lugubrious even. It takes its time and doesn't really pick up until the final few chapters, where the seemingly unconnected plot threads begin to converge, sort of. I would say that it's super inventive space opera, maybe to the point of being fiddly. If you delight in the world building, if you enjoy unravelling a complex plot, if you like a sense of wonder of the completely different in your science fiction reading, then this may well work for you too. I've tried to compare it to other things that I've read, but I think it might just be the case that this is unlike anything that I've read before. I admired it, but I found it to be hard work, but ultimately rewarding. I'm glad I read it, and I'm glad I stuck with it, and I will be reading the second part, The Weight of the World, in the coming month. I give The Promise of the Child a discombobulating 8 out of 10. It's a stellar splendour. Next is Hegira by Greg Bear, one of his earliest books, possibly even his first, actually. It's pretty slender, 200 pages, so it's an old school quick read, and I went in knowing almost nothing about it. We're immediately introduced to the three characters who we follow on their journey. They're on a quest. One is a soldier, a veteran of a so-called long march and killer of hundreds or even thousands over that time. Another is his manservant, and one is a penitent scholar who seeks his woman, his partner, who has vanished or died or something. It quickly becomes apparent that Hegira, the planet we're on, is enormous. Gas giant enormous. Spaced at regular intervals are enormous columns or obelisks, which are hundreds of kilometres tall and covered in closely packed glyphs, containing, as legend would have it, the sum total of human knowledge. Among the competing factions on the planet, there is a race to get further up the obelisks. The knowledge gets more advanced the higher up that you go. And it seems that nobody's got higher so far than a couple of kilometres by balloon, and much knowledge of the so-called firstborn remains a mystery. What are these obelisks? Who put them there? And why are there no stars, or a sun for that matter? And how is Hegira so large without having a crushing gravity? Hegira is part standard issue fantasy quest to begin with, a trio of mismatched characters, but as we progress, more and more science fiction elements are revealed. It's partly big dumb object trek akin to Ringworld or Orbitsville perhaps, and part benevolent alien intervention in the style of Childhood's End, maybe, sort of. There is a lot going on. I like the characters, I like their flip, the change in focus from the hero type to the nerdy ex-scholar who, it becomes apparent, is the more important of the two. So I like the characters, but I didn't care all that much about them. I found them a little bit dry. I enjoyed learning more about Hegira, why it's there, and the true purpose of the quest. So overall, I liked it, but I didn't love it. I give Hegira 7 out of 10. It's a planetary pleasure. Next up is The Windup Girl by Paolo Bacigalupi, and in summary, I loved it. We're in Thailand, specifically in Bangkok, and we're in the 23rd century, and the world is in a mess. There have been droughts, there have been wars, flooding, seemingly all the result of climate change. Bangkok is now well below sea level, kept dry by a series of dams and levees and pumping stations. Global agriculture is dominated by a small number of so-called calorie companies, the evil megacorps of this world, controlling food production through gene-hacked seeds. They're not afraid to use bioterrorism or private armies and economic hitmen to create markets for their products. And fossil fuel is long in the past. Combustion engines are extremely rare, the preserve of the ultra-wealthy or the ultra-powerful. Power is, in general, provided by either animal labour in Bangkok. This is mostly in the form of giant megadonts, kind of mammoth, megafauna, elephant mashup type thing. And then there are kink springs, which store power and are used to drive all sorts of things, everything from motorbikes to fridges to handguns. Thailand is alone in the world in not relying on the calorie companies, preferring to rely on heritage sea stock and being permanently vigilant for the spread of plant disease. I really love the world building in this book. It's lush and vivid without being in the foreground. So there's lots of detail is given in the incidentals in the passing as the plot develops. There have been cycles of expansion and contraction, of disease and plagues and war, and religious fundamentalism have killed millions upon millions and have driven waves of migration as a result. Anderson Lake is one of our main characters, and he's working undercover for Agrigen, one of the hated calorie companies. Visiting a sex club, he meets Amiko, a so-called wind-up, a hichikichi. Developed in Japan due to dramatically declining population as companions, the wind-ups, or new people, are accepted in Japan, but illegal in Thailand. After being ditched by her visiting Japanese owner, Amiko is now an indentured sex slave, doing degrading things, but her conditioning and design means that she wants or needs and enjoys it. But on the plus side for her, her conditioning and design hide certain other capabilities, let's call them. Lake becomes obsessed with Amiko, and their fates from that point on are entwined. I really love being in this world, and I enjoyed the cut and thrust of the plot. There are numerous competing factions in Thailand, plus there's the migrants, the so-called yellow cards, and the Farang, the barely tolerated and mistrusted Westerners. I loved Amiko as a character, and she really comes into her own as the book develops. If you haven't read The Windup Girl, then I really recommend it. I give The Windup Girl 9 out of 10. It's a galactic gem. Next, I read The Separation by Christopher Priest, and the setup for this involves a journalist and a historian in 1999. But it's in 1999 where it's clear that World War II, the German War, ended in May 1941 and not in 1945 as we know it. And history has been rather different since then. The journalist or author is researching a J.L. Sawyer who he believes played a part in the final day of the war. We then get a series of flashbacks to J.L. Sawyer's activities before and during the war. To complicate matters, there are two J.L. Sawyers, identical twin brothers, Joe and Jack, who are often mistaken for each other. And the notion of a doppelganger is visited a number of times in the book. Winston Churchill is known to have had at least one body double, for example. And so one J.L. is a pilot in Bomber Command, and the other is a conscientious objector, driving a Red Cross ambulance in the Blitz. So we're in an alternate history, right? Well, Priest certainly tees it up that way, but then proceeds to mess with our heads. We get chapters that appear to be from history that we know, with the war continuing on into 1945, and then others that appear to be from the history that the guy from the prologue is researching. And we also get splinters of history that might be from either or even neither. I got the impression that many possible histories could exist. The roles played by the brothers and the fates that await them are different in each of these segments, and sometimes subtly and sometimes substantially. The Separation is a novel of inflection points, of cusps of change. And the first half focuses mostly on the bomber pilot, and then the second on the conscientious objector. We see the same time periods play out from their different perspectives. Events are not clear cut, and we get the impression that both JLs are potentially unreliable narrators, or at least their hindsight may be less than 2020. There are some nice, rather tenuous links between the 1940s timeline and the alternate 1999, and a nice moment where one such link is broken, where the timelines seem to cross or borrow from each other. The relationship between both JLs and a German refugee Birgit that they helped smuggle out of Berlin before the war is nicely done, and fittingly for identical twins. They both love her. I found The Separation to be an easy read. Priest's writing is clear and concise, it's sparse, precise, even if what he's saying is often confusing or unsettling, designed to put us off balance. I give The Separation 8 out of 10. It's a stellar splendour. Next, I read The Sparrow by Mary Doria Russell, and this is a book that seems to elicit strong opinions. You either love it or hate it, and there doesn't seem to be any middle ground. So what did I think? The SETI team at Arecibo in Puerto Rico have picked up a signal from outer space, and it's a musical signal, to a certain ear, divine in nature and close too, at least as far as interstellar distances go. Slightly randomly, it's the Jesuits that see an opportunity to explore the divine, to seek more of God's children, and they decide to fund a mission to visit Rakat, the planet of the peace and the source of the signal in the Alpha Centauri system. The book has an interesting structure. We sort of flip between chapter by chapter between two eras. One around 2019 and the few years that follow that, and then another in 2060. In the 2060 timeline, we've got a Jesuit priest, Emilio Sandos, who's recuperating in the care of his order. And it's quickly apparent that he is the sole survivor of the mission. He's blamed for many things, and there will be a hearing ultimately when he's well enough, a reckoning. Back in the earlier timeline, in 2019, we follow Emilio Sandos as a younger priest, a skilled linguist and missionary. He has an ambiguous relationship with his faith. And you could argue that the book is really about him not caring, then finding, and then losing, and then possibly finding again his faith in God. The first half of the book is spent getting ready to go on the mission. Mainly, it's a vehicle to thoroughly introduce us to a small group of people, Emilio's friends, that end up being the crew for the mission. Slightly improbably, in my view. In the other timeline, Emilio goes through some things. He's accused, he's confronted and misunderstood, but also cared for. He is deeply traumatized by his experience on Rakat, the details of which are gradually, and I do mean gradually, revealed during the book. The Sparrow is a slow burn then. It could be argued that way too much time is spent building the relationships, the friendships and the loves between the group that surround Emilio. And I think there is some merit in that case. I think Russell does drag it out. But you could also argue that it's a necessary evil. I think Russell really wants us to invest in those characters and the strength of those bonds. It's important so that the gut punches, the traumas that Emilio goes through are experienced and felt, even if only vicariously and from the safety of your comfy reading chair. I thought that the sections on Rakat were well done. The first contact elements worked well, I think. There are two variants of sentient alien, one subservient and enslaved even, but much more prevalent numerically, and a ruling class descended on the same planet from an apex predator. Most of the time is spent in a village of the slave species where the humans are made welcome. The alien flora and fauna isn't 100% compatible with our digestive systems, and it's a dangerous place, all of which takes its toll on the close-knit crew. Overall, I thought that the payoff in the final chapters, as the whole tale comes to a crescendo in both time periods, was worth the extremely slow build. I give The Sparrow 8 out of 10. It's a stellar spender. Next was Lady of Mazes by Karl Schroeder, and this is a stranger old book. Out around the orbit of Jupiter, we're on Tevan Coronal, an isolated ring orbital 2,000 kilometres across, where communities can live as they choose with the tech levels that they prefer, enforced by something called tech locks. These manifolds can overlap partly or even entirely, perception of the other rendered impossible via the tech locks. Some people, so-called diplomats, can adjust their mental state. They can think themselves into another manifold that overlaps or borders their own. And with this, Schroeder imagines our environment and the things that we can and can't do in it being first and foremost a manifestation of our values, which is then codified by the tech locks. So you see what you feel comfortable seeing and can do what you feel comfortable doing. And in this way, Kingi's Raven manifold, a low technology, primitive back to nature type environment, coexists with Livia's high-tech Westerhaven. The people of Westerhaven can access Inkscape, it's a pervasive virtual reality. They can replace themselves with an anime, leaving mid-conversation if they want for the anime to continue. And they can invoke something called a society, a virtual grouping of gossiping, squabbling advisors made up of friends and family, past and present. On Tevan, then, the boundaries between the real and the virtual are blended. Livia is one such diplomat, and she goes to Raven to investigate reports of impossibles, entities or people that should not be there, that the tech locks should prevent. These impossibles, it turns out, have dastardly plans. And Schroeder builds us a pretty richly detailed picture of life on Tevan Coronal and then gets busy destroying it, or at least changing it irrevocably. The majority of Lady of Mazes is Livia and Kingi escaping Tevan Coronal with some help from Aaron, an old friend of Livia's, to seek some answers. Who or what is the mysterious 3340, the entity behind the impossibles, and why is it bent on destroying or remaking Tevan? And what is the mysterious nebula that surrounds the Coronals? And can Tevan Coronal be saved? Whilst bewildered at times, I did like the world building, and there were some neat ideas. On one coronal that the main characters visit, there's an odd sort of democracy operating. Any sufficiently large community of like-minded individuals triggers the Inkscape to create a vote, a virtual individual whose entire reason for existence, their purpose, is to represent that community in the council or parliament. Lady of Mazes is not an easy read. I felt like I was hanging on by my fingertips throughout. There's very little exposition, quite a lot like the Tom Toner book. You just have to figure it out as you go. A little more background information is revealed as the book progresses, so it's not one to skim through on autopilot. I am intrigued by the world building, and I gather that Ventus would be a logical next read of the 2 or 3 of the Schroeders that I have on my shelves. I give Lady of Mazes 7 out of 10. It's a planetary pleasure. Next, I read Against the Dark Background by Iain M. Banks, and this is one of his non-culture science fiction books. Lady Sparrow is the protagonist, and she seems to have a price on her head. We get lots of flashbacks to her past life as a child, as a teenager and a student and so on. And her cousin and half-sister feature large in those flashbacks. Having read a few Banks books, I assume that those flashbacks are there for a reason. They're not mere padding, and indeed they are key to plot resolutions that come later on. In this book, there are not 1 but 2 MacGuffins or plot coupons, I've heard them described as, in pursuit of which Sparrow and her team chase around the Galter system. MacGuffin number 1, The Universal Principles, an ancient book, and desired by the Sad Brothers, one of several quirky but powerful religious sects in the book, in return for the freedom of Sparrow's half-sister. But also because it might point to where the last remaining laser gun is stashed. It's never really explained what the laser gun is or what it can do, although it is strongly implied in the book that it's a rather potent weapon. So potent that others are intent on getting to it first, or on co-opting Sparrow and her team to get it for them. The representatives of this other group are bald-headed twins or possibly clones that apply pressure to Sparrow via what initially seems to be a voodoo doll, causing her extreme pain. The whole book is really a giant chase across the solar system with added heists. Sparrow and her former bonded military team spend a lot of time travelling from place to place, trying to find clues to the location of the first one, then the second of the 2 MacGuffins, often on one planet or another and sometimes in the space between. There are fights, there are treks, backwards societies on backwards planets, an android city, moving motorway rest stops, battles of various kinds and robberies to boot. Overall, I once again, I liked it, but I didn't love it. I give Against the Dark Background 7 out of 10. It's a planetary pleasure. All of that leaves me with a tie for first place. I think I've given it enough love to the Sun Eater series in the last 12 months, which means that my book of the month is The Windup Girl by Paolo Bacigalupi. As always, thank you for watching, and until next time, goodbye for now.